Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I am joined by Fred Rutler. Fred has been a retirement plan specialist for over 25 years, and he is a partner and managing director at Creative Planning Retirement Services. His team focuses on driving optimal outcomes for plan sponsors and their employees. I have known Fred for close to 10 years now. Full disclosure, Fred was actually a part of Lockton's retirement team where I work. And Lockton sold our retirement business to Creative Planning, reinvesting all of the proceeds into the business and creating a joint venture. So I've known Fred for a long time. He's a good friend of mine, very knowledgeable when it comes to the retirement plan space. And that was why I was excited to bring him on. I have tried with this podcast to stay away from making it too much about the business space that I play in, which is total rewards. But when it comes to managing the people side of a business, what we pay, how we reward people, the types of incentives, the types of retirement plans we put in place, all of these things are critically important. And so I do want to highlight them. And Fred is a fantastic person to do that, as you will see in this conversation. We get into some basics on retirement plans and on 401ks in particular, and then talk broadly about different risk, different investment strategies, different ways that employers can build these plans. There's a ton in here for anyone who is interested in getting smart on the current state and potential future state of retirement plans at work. I hope you enjoy it. It was a lot of fun for me. I always enjoy talking to Fred. He, as you will see, is a great person to have a conversation with because he is so thoughtful and so knowledgeable. Here is Fred Rutler. Fred, welcome to the show. It is always a blast to talk to you, and it's fun to do it with a microphone and a recording going on now. So I'm excited to see what we come up with here.
Me too. Excited to see how this plays out.
When I started this podcast 4.5 years ago, I was very conscious not to overdo it on the total rewards content, given that that is what I do day to day. And I didn't want to make this just a sales mouthpiece for what we do. But I think I may have overcorrected on that and stayed away from some topics that are really relevant in the workplace when it comes to how we pay and reward people. And I think it is long overdue that you and I sit down and talk about retirement programs because everybody needs them. Most companies offer them, but there's a lot going on in that world, and there's a lot that you can do right or wrong or get yourself in trouble with. So excited to dive into it today.
Yeah, no, me too, O'Brien.
All right. So let's set the table a little bit here. What are the different types of vehicles that companies are using for employees' retirement? And when do they get used? How prevalent are each of the different types and what are they used for?
Yeah, so in the employer space, you have, your 401k is the most common. And that is used for-profit companies. It's a tax-deferred vehicle for employees to utilize. On the smaller end, you do have IRAs that are built for companies like a Simple or a SEP IRA as well. But most often, you're going to hear 401k as the key term. There's also 403b, which are retirement plans that function very much like a 401k. And over the years, they've become very, very similar, where they're more for not-for-profit companies or hospitals and other companies like that. Beyond that, you have non-qualified plans or deferred compensation. And then the last thing I would mention there are pension plans, which those were very prevalent years ago. And we've been seeing them decline over the years because they're a little bit more of a mandatory contribution. And so with some exceptions, like some plan design in the pension space, we've been seeing those go away. So maybe a little bit of a wordy answer, but that's kind of the spectrum that we tend to play in.
And can you expand on what a non-qualified deferred comp plan is? Because I think people hear that a lot, and there's still a lot of mystery around what that actually is.
Yeah, so we actually have specialists that really dig into that, but I'll take a swing at it. The idea behind the non-qualified deferred compensation or a 457 plan is when you have a smaller subset of your employee population, typically highly compensated folks, but you're trying to figure out another vehicle for them from a saving standpoint or a compensation standpoint. You hear the term golden handcuffs, some of those things that can be created in that type of arrangement. It is outside of ERISA, which ERISA governs what goes on in the 401k. So it gives you some more flexibility. There's certainly some downsides to it. It's important to understand how the funding works for those plans as well. But they're kind of looked at, and some are kind of referred to as a top hat plan, like it goes on top of the 401k for certain employees.
Okay. And the other one I want to bring up is profit sharing plans, because I talk to a lot of companies, they have profit sharing plans. I know others have thought about profit sharing. What's the difference between a 401k and a profit sharing plan?
By definition, a 401k is a profit sharing plan, but the way that it's really looked at is that it's kind of a component of the 401k. So the 401k refers to the employee deferral and a match and how you would handle that. Really, how we think about profit sharing these days is it's the portion of the plan where you're just making employer contributions, and it doesn't matter if I'm participating as an employee. You're just going to get these contributions through the plan. The other thing I would say too, and you and I have talked about this before with groups that we've talked to, is that it really doesn't have to mean you're making profits. And you can still make it if you're not making profits. So it's just what we look at as like a non-elective contribution that's just put into the plan.
Right. So you have your match. Okay. Employees only get the match if they're putting in their dollars. When people refer to a profit sharing plan, those are just dollars that everybody gets into a retirement account, regardless of whether they contribute anyway.
Yeah. And I would say too, just this conversation kind of shows kind of the confusion that profit sharing plans can bring into the equation. And one of the things that has been interesting is we see profit sharing plans, you see them less and less. A lot of times people that had pension plans before, the move was to go to a profit sharing. So there's a little bit more discretion in it for employers. But then they've still had those in the plan. And what we've been finding is that employees don't really understand what that means either at times. And we've had situations with multiple kind of analysis with multiple groups where you may have a match, and I'll give an example that's 100% of 3%, and you may have a profit sharing that's 3%. As an employee, I should want the profit share because I don't have to do anything to get it. But what we have found is that the perception out there is that employees understand the term match, and so they like match more. They appreciate match more. And so we've had discussions with groups who had been doing profit sharing, and the idea of like, hey, if you move that to a match, that it's what we've been finding when we do interviews with employees and we understand it. So the topic is complex, not only for kind of this conversation, but employees have a hard time getting it too.
So do you advise employers to do away with profit sharing completely, or is it more like, hey, if you're only doing profit sharing now, you may actually get more value by turning all or some of those dollars into a match? Or you could do some match, some profit sharing, and sort of protect people on both ends from that standpoint.
Yeah, you certainly can do all profit sharing, or you could do some of each. Some companies just like to have it. It's part of their culture, like, hey, at the end of the year, we like to give a contribution, and they're very good about communicating what it is. And that would be the one thing that we generally talk about is if you're doing it, we think that's great, and it's a great benefit for the employees. But I think the communication around it is pretty important, because sometimes employees will just view it like, when am I getting my 2%?
Yeah.
Like that's now part of my compensation as far as I'm concerned. And so we do have a lot of discussions around that, because I don't think a lot of employers haven't gone through kind of the survey process or gone through our compensation and benefit analysis to understand, like, what do employees really see value in? And so that discussion that we'll tend to have is let's just make sure we understand how the benefit you're putting out there is being received, to make sure you're maximizing the bang for your buck, because you're spending good money to make those contributions.
Yeah. let's talk about those contributions in the match again for a little bit more here. I have heard the number 10% thrown around, as in if an employee wants to be able to retire, they need to be saving 10% of their paycheck through their working career. Is that still the number that we're referencing these days?
I've seen 10, I've seen 15 now kind of popping up. And obviously a lot of it depends on how old you are and when you receive that message.
Yeah.
But it is more than we expect, and getting employees to understand that it's tax deductible, right? Like it's tax deferred. You're not paying it up front. It's not going to hurt as much as you think, but knowing that some employees, it still hurts and they can't do it. But it is the more you can kind of get into this, a lot of times the better.
Yeah. I just think that's an interesting point to make or to remember when you're putting these plans together, because obviously there's a cost to the company to do any kind of profit sharing or any kind of match. But oftentimes we think, we're doing 3%, 100% of 3%. And that's great. Employees get 6% in their account if they max out the match. But that's not going to get them all the way to retirement. And so yeah. I think there's just this interesting behavioral thing where people can maybe feel like they're covered, but they're not going to be covered when they get to the end of the line.
So I think I accidentally found retirement, when I was coming out of college, but then I've grown to love it. And one of the things that has been really interesting for me because of my nerd side is the behavioral economics and the behavioral psychology that goes into these. Even the construction of 401ks, like the fact that it's taken out of your paycheck and you don't have to do anything. That's the biggest thing that makes these work, because if we had to decide to take money out of our checking account and put it in, it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And as we look at match, it's kind of similar, like on what we're putting in, like we tend to, like in that example, like here's the free money and here's where it stops. And so that's where I'm going to stop. Whereas there is potentially some value for me going to a higher level to really get where I need to be, but it just needs to be explained and employees need to understand kind of how that works.
Yeah. Yeah, the psychology behind retirement plans is fascinating, right? I mean, I've done an episode on here before on the psychology of money and how people think about money can change their conversations both internally and in their households around money. And it's just such a fascinating conversation. We all have different relationships with it. And there's all these different default behaviors that we all have.
Yeah. And I think on the match too, we use that example of 100% of 3. And sometimes we'll see, a company will say, you know what, we're going to stretch the match. So it's going to be 50% of 6. And what ends up happening there is you still get to the same number, but the employer may pay less because not everybody's going to put away the full 6. And so we have had some companies that are like, that's something we're going to do is maybe a cost measurement standpoint. But the majority of those discussions are more around encouraging behavior.
Yeah.
How do we get folks more engaged and how are they able to take advantage of this match? Because now you've got that 3%, but now you've put away 6% of your own money. So it makes a big difference. And now we're starting to get closer to that number you talked about, right? Yeah. And that's where we start to see kind of the retirement readiness scores of these employees start to tick up over time. And to that point, I think one of the other interesting things that kind of came out that was another behavioral psychology thing was the advent of automatic enrollment. I think you think about like where some of this came from. I think it was Australia had, you were getting a driver's license and you had to tell them that you didn't want to be an organ donor as opposed to saying, put me down as an organ donor. And the rate that they got back was insane. And it was just because of inertia and because people that were doing that were just like, well, whatever, And so the same thing was kind of applied to automatic enrollment, where it was like, if we just say to the employees, we just change the wording a little bit, where it's like, hey, you're in the plan at a certain level, unless you tell us you want to get out. What we found is that 90% of the people stay in. And so it's an effective tool for the right company. It's not always the right thing. And some companies don't like the concept, right? Like, so it really has to fit for the company, but we've seen a big trend in that. And we've also seen higher participation rates, higher retirement readiness scores for people that are using it effectively.
When would it not be appropriate?
So I think in general, when we see, and we had a client where when we started working with them, they had put it into play, but they had a lot of turnover. They put the deferral rate at a very low level. And so when people were using it, what was happening is we were getting a lot more employees into the plan with really, really small balances. And when they were leaving, there was turnover. It was causing administration issues. Not to get too much in the weeds, but it also diluted the average account balance of the plan. And so the record keeper that was charging them to run this plan was like, this is a less profitable piece of business than it was 6 months ago. And that came from somebody had just heard automatic enrollment's a good idea. And let's not do too much because we're not ready for that yet. But like that combination created 3 or 4 problems. And so I think there are some questions to ask when you're thinking about doing that, where you need to understand kind of your employee population, turnover rate, et cetera. The other thing that I would say can go astray, and it's not necessarily what is going wrong, it's maybe constructing the automatic enrollment plan the right way. Because it's an easier decision path to be like, we didn't have it before, so let's just do it at 2%. We don't want to do any auto escalation, which auto escalation means at the end of a year or at some defined point in time, you go up 1% and then you go up another percent a year later and so on. And so sometimes companies are like, let's take this in steps. And then you put it at 2%. And what it's doing is defaulting people at 2. And so we go back to that same discussion of like, you're basically making it easy for people at 2, and maybe they should be putting away 10.
Yeah.
And then if we're not auto escalating them 5 years later, I'm still at 2. And the progress that I'm being made may actually be restricted by the way that it was constructed. So there's a lot that goes into setting these up and make sure they're being set up right.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because it takes so long for these accounts to build that the gratitude isn't there right away. Yeah. But I mean, I've talked to a lot of people. My father-in-law has a good story where his business partner just refused to let them put in a 401k for years and years. And they finally convinced him to do it. And like 5 years after he did it, he looked at the balance and was like, wow, there's actually some money in here. And, he wound up kicking himself for not doing it sooner. And, they all kicked him too for not doing it sooner. But it is one of those things that if you can start it early and you can get people on the right track and you can help them default to healthy behaviors, like there's a lot of value to that in somebody's life down the line.
I totally agree. We hear stories like that all the time where somebody won't even know that they have a plan because they just got defaulted in and they get ready to leave or they're thinking about retiring and they don't realize that they have $60,000 sitting in an account with their name on it because, it is important. And I agree with you 100%. Like, and I think about the mission of our industry, it is certainly to get engagement. Participation is great. Engagement is even better. And there's a cycle, when you're younger, it is about accumulation. It's about saving. I do this for a living. I wish I would have started a lot earlier, at a higher level, a lot earlier. And the more you can put away on the accumulation side of the equation is fantastic. And as you get closer to retirement, then you start thinking more about investment strategies and other things that you should be doing. But just getting started is the key.
Yeah. I remember seeing the math somewhere that if you save 10% from, what was it, like 22 to 32, like the first 10 years out of college, and then stopped and never saved another dollar, you'd have more than someone who started at 32 and saved to 65.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And I know there's some nuances to that math, but roughly that's how it works, that if you start earlier, just the nature of compounding, the numbers get so big later that consistently upfront, starting early is more important than doing it the whole time.
Yeah. And that just doubles down on the importance of education and engagement, or having some sort of structure where there's an automation to it. Because I think employees have so much going on that they're not always thinking about, how much they put away. And sometimes, especially if your match is, 25% of 4 or 50% of 4, to me, I would see that and I'd be like, they must have decided that 4 is the right number for me, and it's very important to kind of get ahead of that.
Yeah. And so many companies don't want to tell employees what to do, but it does seem to be one of those areas where you can help people make smart decisions. Like they are going to fall to defaults, and you can help them improve the quality of their later life.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So let's pivot a little bit. I was going to ask you this early, but we had a good conversation there. For employers that are putting these plans together, we hear a lot about fiduciary responsibility and, you're a fiduciary on the plan. What is an employer's fiduciary responsibility? What does that mean? And what are the risks of doing that wrong?
Yeah, it's a big topic. Sometimes when we're having a discussion, we'll have drinking games on how often you say the word fiduciary in the plan in our business, not in the meeting, obviously, but and it can be used the wrong way too. Like, I think having a good fiduciary process, the beauty of it is the recipients of a good fiduciary process are the employees. They get better cost funds, they get better costs on their fees, but there is a scary side to it. And I think at times folks will use that scary side inappropriately to try to frighten someone about it. But I think at the end of the day, when we see what your fiduciary responsibilities are, it's making sure that you have the right record keeper. It's making sure that you've analyzed your advisor that you're working with, that your funds are working the way that they should, that your fees are low. There are a lot of components that go into it. And most companies will have a retirement plan committee. So you'll have 3, 5, 7 people on a committee that are helping to make decisions with the 401k. Some are voting, some are non-voting, but their responsibility exists because you're helping to make decisions about the 401k. You don't have to be on the committee to have fiduciary responsibility. There are people in plans that are fiduciaries that probably have no idea because they're submitting payroll for the fiduciary, like they're getting that in or for the plan. And so what we always do when we're working with clients, especially up front, is we have a fiduciary training on what is a fiduciary and like, what does that really mean? And it really gets down to kind of, are you documenting? Are you making sure all of this is happening? There is some personal liability that can be associated with it. So I don't mean to say that it's not scary, because it can be if you're not following the right rules, like where it can come back on you individually. But I think that's really where you get into the importance of having a good process or a good partner to help manage that and make sure that it's being done right.
How often does that happen where somebody individually gets involved? It would seem to me like that would have to be like really gross negligence or almost like malicious intent.
Yeah, it is. When it gets to that level, it typically means that you're withholding money and maybe doing something with it with the intent of putting it back in. We've seen, folks that have taken that and then they've made purchases and they've put it back in like a month later. And it's things like that where now you're in trouble.
Yeah.
If you have a late contribution or if something like there's an error in the plan, you may get fined, but the plan gets fined or the company gets fined. But yeah, it has to be pretty egregious to get to that level.
Okay. Yeah.
But we do have, it is a topic that we always are ready to talk about. And I think we're pretty good at it, but a lot of the advisors out there in this space are very good at it, because when we look at how we construct kind of the cadence over the course of a year with our partners, there's a need to kind of make sure we're checking the boxes of the things that you would be asked for if you were audited by the Department of Labor or if you were sued. Because that's where the fiduciary liability kind of comes into play, where someone says, hey, I'm suing you because this fund is underperforming. Even if they're wrong, you want to have a documented process to kind of make sure that you're in a good spot. Those tend to happen on much, much larger plans. But the scary trend that we've seen is some copying and pasting and seeing this a little bit down market as well. So the emphasis on that, and again, not to be a scare tactic, but like the emphasis that we have with clients is like, let's just make sure we button everything up. And again, the thing that I would always come back to on that is like when we do our job well together, the participants get a better experience. They get better communication. They get better funds. They get better fees.
Yeah. So it's basically just have a process for making decisions and document that process.
Yeah. Document with a capital D, right?
Yeah.
And you'll see it. Like if you're audited, we've seen enough to where we know the questions that typically are asked for, and to be able to say, hey, show me your investment policy statement, show me kind of your meeting minutes for the last 4 quarters, to be able to kind of just say, hey, we've got that. Here's why we changed this fund. And there's an art to it too. On your reading minutes, you don't want to be overly specific, but there's an aspect to it to where you want to make sure that you're answering all the questions before they're asked.
Got it. And another piece of fiduciary responsibility now is how you even set up the plan. You talk about 321, 338, and now at 316. What do those numbers mean for anybody who's maybe heard them but don't understand them?
Yeah, they're all sections of code, right? Like, so they explain the level of fiduciary support that you're getting. And in a nutshell, like the 321 and 338 are designed as kind of investment fiduciary support. They're very similar. But if somebody is contemplating which one should I do, the 321 fiduciary model is basically like if you're my client, I would bring recommendations to you about like, hey, this fund, we want to replace it. And here's why. And here are the funds that we're thinking about. And then if I'm doing my job, I'm also then saying, here's the one we think makes the most sense. You or your committee then make the decision of yes, no, or we want that other one. The discretion lies with you. On the 338, it's the same steps. Here's what we're doing. Here's why. Here are the funds we looked at, but here's the one we're putting in. But now the discretion lies with us. We're kind of just informing you of what we're doing and why we're doing it. But by moving that discretion off of your plate onto your advisor's plate, it absolves you of a little bit more of that liability, which it's been a trend for sure, because we have seen, back to the lawsuits and all that, we've seen a spike. 2023 was higher than 22. We're seeing some stuff in 2024. So we've seen a lot of companies going to that, or, companies that are 321 to start, and then they get 2 years into the relationship and they're like, we've never questioned anything you've told us. So what are we doing here?
Yes.
So that's the difference between those. And the last thing I would say on that, just because it is not uncommon for folks to take a few minutes to think about, like, well, what do we want to do here? I think 321 tends to be a good fit when you've got committee members that are very engaged, have very specific opinions on investments, and like to have a little bit of direction with it. That's the biggest thing that we see. 338 is more of, hey, we're not the experts. You all are. We just want to make sure we understand it. 321 can sometimes also have some bottlenecks because sometimes the decision goes out there and 5 people are arguing about it. That takes a couple of quarters. There are like pros and cons to each. And the difference is minimal on the fiduciary liability, but 338 is more. On 316, so that's on the administrative side of the equation.
Okay.
And it is a newer entrant into the fiduciary mitigation space, but it is where a lot of mistakes happen. It's the little bumps and bruises that you run into with late contributions or filing something incorrectly or not following the right definition of compensation. And what you're doing with the 316 is you're basically hiring either the record keeper or a third party to be responsible for making sure that those things are happening, that the notices are going out, that the loan approvals are happening, and you absolve yourself of the responsibility around those and the liability associated with it. So it isn't as much of the high frequency events, but it's definitely higher volume. And so we're seeing companies that are starting to use that. It's become pretty popular.
Interesting. So why would someone want to do that? Is it like further down the scale from a 338 where we want to outsource this to you. Now it's like, we want to outsource the decision making and we want to outsource the administration of this.
Yeah. So I think the companies make a decision if they're working with advisors, and some advisors can't be fiduciaries. So, and if the advisor or your partner or some other third party isn't the fiduciary, it's important to know as an employer, that's you, because your record keeper is not doing it. Right. And so that's your responsibility. So who's going to help you with that? And so when you're making that decision, you either go 338 or 321. So that's kind of one decision point. There are certain circumstances where you can have a little bit of both, but usually you're picking one or the other. And then so it's either or, and then the 316 can be in, right? Like you can add it in if you want. There's a cost to it. And that's what companies have to look at is like, there's a cost. Sometimes there are some restrictions because whoever is managing that may say, hey, we can only do these things. And so companies then have to look at it and say, hey, is that worth it? It's less popular than the others, but it's gaining momentum. And if I could jump off from there, I would say one of the other big topics in our industry over the last few years has been pooled employer plans.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that next.
Yeah. So I think pooled employer plans is one of those things that kind of ties these things together. Where they come into play is the idea behind a pooled employer plan is you're responsible for submitting your payroll, make sure it's timely. You're responsible for evaluating what's called your PPP. So it's kind of the person that's responsible for the whole pooled plan solution. And then that's kind of it. And then what happens from there is the administration load lessens quite a bit. The liability associated with those administrative items lessens. You're getting the 338 fiduciary. So we've been seeing companies really starting to jump into this space more even than I thought. So when it first started to come out, I thought smaller companies are going to use it to get leverage, to get economies of scale for pricing, or companies that don't want to go through an audit. Like a lot of the pool plans you sign up, you don't have to do your own audit anymore because the bigger plan is doing more.
It's almost like a captive, right?
Yeah, it's very simple.
Like you're putting all the quote unquote risk together with other employers. You're basically putting your retirement plan together with a bunch of other employer retirement plans, and they're using the scale of that to go get better pricing, access to better funds, and then they have somebody who is making all the fiduciary decisions as far as the investments, and they're running all the administration of the plan. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the fact that those kind of arrangements have been set up in kind of the benefits world made the explanation of what it was easier than I thought it was going to be. It's just like, oh yeah, we get the concepts.
Yeah.
And but that is really what it is. And what we had found was larger companies were actually using this quite a bit because of cost, but there's areas of legal risk that is kind of like reduced on your end that means a lot to them. And some companies will say, hey, look, our business isn't spending much time running a 401k.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure it's good. Somebody else can handle that part of it. As long as our employees are getting good funds and good fees and good education, that's all we want. And so it's been interesting to see kind of the wide range of companies that have really been looking at it. But it goes back to what you said in the very beginning. It's just, how do you figure out ways to manage that liability as much as you can?
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's pivot and talk about the actual investments in these types of plans. What makes a good investment lineup?
Well, a lot of it depends on, what the company's goals and objectives are, what your demographics look like. But in general, I think in most situations, what we tend to like to see is, having a diversity, right? Like, so you can kind of diversify your investments. You want to have typically either a money market or a stable value. So that kind of fund where somebody doesn't want to be in the market and they're close to retirement or they're just frightened and they want to get out and get into a safe spot.
Some kind of cash equivalent.
Yeah. Money market is a good example of that.
Yeah.
Where you see like, hey, I'm going to get a smaller return, but I'm going to feel better about it.
Yeah.
Then you had like fixed income bond funds that are in the plan. You have equity, which is, like your large cap, your S&P 500, your small cap, your international. You want to have kind of a mixture of those so that you can have a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more conservative so that you can diversify. And an additional diversification within those is almost all of our clients now are offering index funds. So you'll have active options that are a little bit more expensive in those spaces, but then you'll have index in each of those spaces too. So employees that are index investors or don't want to really, there's like, just give me the benchmark. They can kind of go there.
So is it like you've got the breakdown of the different investment categories? You got stocks, you got bonds. Stocks are broken out into different segments of the market: domestic, international, large, small. And what you're saying is you're offering kind of one thing in each of those categories, and then you're offering a comparable index in each of those categories.
That's oftentimes what we do.
Okay.
And sometimes you'll have a few funds in a category, depending on the situation. And sometimes you might not have a fund in the category. Like you could make a case that a mid-cap value fund isn't necessarily, because the large value and the small value kind of overlap in that space. But like those are the kind of conversations we like to have with committees to understand kind of what their perspective is. But generally speaking, that's kind of the approach that we take. And then you do have the ability to say, hey, I want a real estate fund, or, like there are sector funds. I think we just have to be careful, because if you get sector funds in there and they get too nuanced, it gets a little bit tricky, because an employee who may not be a part of the investment committee may just look and see that fund provided 50% last year, and I'm just going to shove all my money into it. And then they're on a little bit more of a volatile ride than they want to be.
Yeah.
So those are things that we like to think about, because menu construction is about creating diversification opportunities, but it's also about knowing that you're building a lineup for a very diverse population of people who really understand the market and who don't. And for some companies, you'll have people that really want very specific funds that wouldn't necessarily be a good fit for everybody. And we'll open, like a brokerage window where an employer can make this available for employees to answer questions, and then they go outside of the plan. So there are ways to address it. You just want to be thoughtful about what employees are having access to.
Where do target date funds fall in these days? I remember when those first came out, everybody was like, this is what everybody should be doing. This is the best thing ever. Do we still feel like it's the best thing ever? Or like, what's the attitude towards target date funds?
We do still feel like they're a very good thing. And that is the last piece of the equation you brought up, is some form of an asset allocation strategy. And it gets back to all of this stuff that we're talking about with regards to how do we make it as easy as possible. And target dates were an iteration of a strategy to make it easy for employees. And so we see target dates listed as the default fund for, I think the latest number I saw was like 70% of plans are doing it. So to your point, it became a very important and popular trend. And I think if I'm thinking up from a safety perspective, that's a good place to be.
Yeah.
The reason for it is to kind of step back on what we'd seen. So I've been in the industry for 25 years, so I've seen kind of like a lot of the movement. And what we used to see on like defaults way back in the day was, hey, if somebody didn't make a decision, maybe it goes into a money market fund. And then people were like, well, that's not the right fit for everybody, because if a 60-year-old or a 20-year-old get defaulted, they're going to both go into a money market fund. So the next step was, now let's get into asset allocation, and a balanced fund was the best version of that, which is just a 60-40 fund. It's a way to say, hey, let's find a line in the middle that's a good compromise. And if people don't know what to do, they can just go into that fund and know that they're relatively in a decent spot. Then came asset allocation strategies, which those are the ones where it's like conservative, moderate, aggressive. And you take a quiz or you just pick, like which one of those are you? And the good thing with that was now you and I could both not necessarily know what we want to do, but we could go into funds that are more appropriate for us, as opposed to just landing in the same spot in a balanced fund if we wanted to take our hands off the steering wheel. But the problem with asset allocation is if you really take your hands off the steering wheel and you go in aggressive and 15 years later you're moderate, the system still thinks you're aggressive. It's not moving you. Yeah. You have to do it yourself. And so that's when target dates came around. I think back in the 90s, I think BlackRock was the first one to do it, I believe. And the idea there, which took a few years to catch on, and then it, to your point, it just took off with the idea of saying, hey, you're going to get put into a fund if you don't tell us what you want to do, or if you don't even want to mess with this, you're going to get put into a fund that's attached to the year that you should retire. And then once you're in there, the closer you get to retirement, the more it kind of goes from equity to fixed income, and it readjusts you. So to the earlier point, like when we think of fiduciary, this ties into fiduciary too. Like having that as your default puts you in a good spot from a fiduciary standpoint when you're kind of creating a mapping strategy. The last thing I would say on this topic, though, there has been a further evolution with regards to managed advice, creating portfolios for employees. And, that again is a discussion that needs to happen with the company to determine, is it the right fit? But where we are seeing a little bit of movement here lately, over the last few years, there's been a pretty good push towards this when it's done right, is that a target date will look at how old are you? So if you're 50, that's all it knows. And it does its job, and it does it really well. The managed part of it would say, you're 50, but here are 5 other things we know about you, based just on what we're seeing coming over from record keeper. You
have another nest egg over here. You're got a health issue. You got like that kind of stuff.
So that stuff can be added. I think even before you get there, I'll know about you, how much money you make. So now I know how old you are and what your salary is, because it's coming in a deferral sheet. And I don't mean me, I mean the system that kind of builds it. Then I know where you live. Again, not in a creepy way, but like generally speaking, like if you're living in Los Angeles versus Kansas City, the cost difference is, cost of living is different. And I'll just know 5 or 6 points the way we build it. Now, not all are built this way, but you'll know those points. And now suddenly your model gets more dynamic. It's considering more things than just your age. And then to your point, if I become engaged, which the statistics have shown when people are using managed accounts, they tend to be more engaged. It tends to draw out engagement in folks. And then I add in, my spouse has a balance. I've got 2 other balances at other companies before I came over. Those things get added into the equation, and it becomes more dynamic. The thing that has to be considered when you're doing that is there's a cost to it. And so depending on how much the cost is, how good the system is, those are the discussions that the committee needs to have and kind of understand those, because there are some managed accounts that are built where you'll just see a big charge and there's not really a whole lot extra being provided. And so it's an important discussion to have, but it has been a very interesting iteration. So I really like where that's going directionally. We are and continue to be big fans of target dates. And then the last thing, since we're down the rabbit hole, if anybody's still listening here, there's also a version where you can kind of create what's called a hybrid, where until you're 45, your target date, starting at 45, your managed advice. What's interesting about these is up until 45 is kind of what we've seen the data points show is accumulation. The amount that you put in is way more important than your asset allocation strategy. Those things are both important, but the amount you're putting in, to your point earlier, if you're doing it 25 to 35, just put it away. That's the key. Then we see at that age, then complexity starts to come in, and it's important for your glide path to be more aligned with where you are and where you're trying to go. And that's where we've seen this advent of this hybrid approach, which is another really interesting option. So there's some good options out there when you think about how you want to do that.
Why 45? Like what starts to happen that you can get into trouble if you're not paying more attention to allocation?
Yeah, we look at that, and in 45 as an example, I think you can pick 45, you could pick 50, you could pick 55. It really comes down to, again, the preference of the company. But what we have seen in some of the data is 45 is where we're starting to see more people that have their incomes start to vary more, like as you kind of progress through your work life.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Some people start to pull ahead. Some people kind of stay where they are. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. The variance is there.
Yeah.
The difference in, having a balance somewhere else that's been growing versus not, like is greater because you've kind of progressed on the line. There are other factors, and it kind of just starts to show that now we're talking about the importance of kind of how we're strategizing. What are our withdrawal plans? What should we be thinking about with regards to Roth versus pre, like all of that kind of that. I mean, that's always an important topic, but like the intricacies of how we're investing just become a little bit more important.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the gap in income that would happen there, but it makes sense, right? You get people who are moving up the ladder and you get other people who are not.
Yeah. Our guys and gals on our team that really work on, think about like how that's constructed. And they're looking at so many data points that it's really interesting. And I'm probably not hitting even some of the key things, but that's one thing that we've seen.
Is AI starting to play a role in this?
Yeah, to a degree, but like I haven't really seen as much of that. I think on the 401k side, we are seeing, some of the record keepers, especially like the big ones, starting to utilize that more in communications and kind of how employees are consuming the information. But there is that other side of the equation where we've got really strict compliance standards. So we have to be careful about how it's being used. I don't know if you're seeing it on your side of the fence, but I've started to see it come into play a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, not as much. Everybody's kind of talking about it on the healthcare side, but I would just think like when you're talking about those managed funds, like I would think that AI would be able to gather a bunch of data points and start to make different adjustments, kind of run the managed fund side of it.
Yeah, I'd have to check and confirm with you exactly how it's done, but I'm sure that that's a part of it.
Yeah, some kind of machine learning, something going on there.
It is an impressive machine when you kind of see the differences and kind of how the allocations break down.
Yeah. Last set of topics I want to talk about with you is focus back on employees. So I know from our conversation, some of the work we've done, that one of the fastest growing services that you all are offering is on the financial well-being standpoint. What are you seeing as far as the biggest need for employees? Is it how to use the 401k, or is it other aspects of their financial life?
It's the latter. I think we did get into the space. We went in heavy, as you know, a couple of years ago with investments in technology and people. And it has been such an interesting ride, because as we've been seeing what people are taking advantage of, it's not as much. I mean, there's certainly discussions around, hey, should I do Roth or regular? Should I put away 3% or 6%? Like those conversations happen. But a lot of times it's more about things that are creating financial stress. And what's been really interesting is how it ties in with just wellness in general. Like, how are we thinking about employees' experiences? And sometimes there's a business side to it, right? Like, the more we can kind of create a better financial environment for our employees, the less likely they are to leave for $1 more an hour to go somewhere else. It's a piece of it, right? But also from an employee standpoint, I think we're just seeing that their questions tend to be more about, where should I put my next dollar? And what should I do about like this beneficiary or this insurance form, or my debt is really crushing me right now. And the discussions have been a lot more focused on that than, just 401k questions.
Yeah. Well, I think that goes back to your point about the importance of setting defaults, because as much education as you want to do around a retirement plan, like most people are just struggling with the day-to-day issues that are coming up financially in their lives. And so they're not even thinking long-term. And if you're asking them, hey, how much do you want to pull out of your paycheck? They're like, none. I got to pay these bills. But if that money just doesn't show up in their paycheck from day one, now they're adjusting to a different lifestyle, and they can't feel it as much. They don't know the difference. And so to me, that reiterates the importance of setting the right defaults, and then the value of going in and then helping them solve the rest of the problems.
Yeah, that's well said. So I've been fortunate enough to be on some really good teams since I've been over at Lockton and then creative planning. And so we always got a lot of gratification from the discussions that we'd have with committees, right? Like, we're really good at kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, keeping everybody safe, driving fees down. and we would leave feeling good. And we had a good like retention rate or whatever, however you put it with our clients. Since we started doing this, there's a different feeling, like, cause we'll talk to our financial wellness specialists that are working with these employees, and they're having discussions that are very different, and they're very like human, like somebody came to one of our wellness consultants the other day and they were trying to figure out what to do with the student loan debt. That's probably one of the biggest topics we're asked about a lot, is what's happening with student loan debt and how can we kind of implement. Well, in this one, it was just a discussion of like, hey, let's go onto this public site, find out how much of it you could get forgiven. And it took him from 250,000 down to 120,000. And like, that's a big deal for anybody. And it's those types of discussions that now employees, and I'm talking about from our standpoint, but I would just say for any group that's helping you do financial wellness, when we're making that kind of progress with employees, helping them with emergency savings, then the good news is filtering back up from the employees to their employers quickly, as opposed to, man, my large cap growth fund is crushing it.
No one ever. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for saving me 20 basis points on the record keeping fee. It's to your point, like it's a delayed gratification kind of thing. This is different. And I think it's doing what I didn't know should be part of our viewpoint, which is really looking at retirement plans as part of the kind of the total rewards or benefits puzzle. It's a piece, but it fits into that, as opposed to just being like, and we offer a retirement plan. The more things we can be doing to be thoughtful of kind of how it fits in the overall total rewards picture, the better. And I think that financial wellness has created some really nice connective tissue there.
Yeah. Well, I think there can be the impression that, employees should be able to figure this stuff out. Everybody, this isn't our responsibility. This is their responsibility. Everybody's different, so we're not going to get involved. And I think doing this show in particular has just reinforced the fact that everything is a skill, and managing your money is totally a skill. And everyone, I think, can agree that the education that we get formally as we come up through school has nothing to do with any of these issues. Like, there's so much real world stuff that we are not prepared for when we hit adulthood. And sure, we can let people go out and fall on their face and figure it out on their own, or we can provide an environment where we support people and help them build the skills so that they can thrive and they can show up and be more productive for our businesses, and they can go be happier at home, which then creates them being happier here at work. And, it's just like all boats rise together. And so I think there can be the philosophy of corporate leadership of like, hey, you come in here and you make widgets and we just want you to make widgets and then you go home. But I just believe more and more that companies are well served to take some of that responsibility, at least on themselves, to say, no, we're going to help our people build the skills that they need to thrive in all aspects of their life, because nobody else is going to.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think that, we even have clients that we work with, especially after COVID, where match was pulled, right? Like there was an ability to put employer contributions in, but they stayed the course on creating the environment, right? Like of creating the habits, knowing that, hey, maybe we'll get back to that if we can, but we're going to continue with the auto enroll. We're going to continue with the education. And I think to your point earlier, like when people put in some money early and then they figure it out later, like the value that has on your health too, when your financial situation is a little bit better, is there's a ton of research drawing correlations between financial stress and days off of work and, overall health versus sickness. And it absolutely plays a role. Financial stress has risen to the top of the charts in some of the recent surveys that we've seen through our own team doing research. And then just the other component of, hey, I can retire on time, or maybe I can retire early. That's really good for me in my life. And B, it doesn't hurt the health and welfare costs either, right?
Yeah.
Like if you've got the right kind of system that's kind of cranking through. And that's how 401k, even though it can be kind of secondary in the thought process behind health and welfare and some of the other things, if it's done right, it can be a really good supporting actor or actress in the equation, you know?
Yeah. Interesting. Last question. Where do you see the future of retirement plans? Like you've mentioned a little bit on sort of the evolution, but is there anything coming down the road? Like wave your magic wand or look into your crystal ball? Like what are things that employers should be paying attention to?
So you've seen some of it start to pop up recently, you know, the legislation requiring if you're setting up a plan for the first time, it's automatic enrollment. Like it's not an option anymore. That's how it needs to be set up. So you can see what the belief is there. And so then sometimes you just have to manage that. We've also seen the rise of state-sponsored plans with the idea of like, hey, if you don't have a plan that you're in right now, you need to have something. Because I think there's a recognition that there's a problem. There's a savings problem that we have. And so that's been happening. There, if you talk to some folks, there's a belief that pooled employer plans are just going to continue to get bigger. We'll see how that plays out. And then the other thing is just kind of that asset allocation strategy. I think we've just been seeing how people are investing, and we've been seeing and I kind of go back to your question about AI, like just the intelligence that can go into some of that some of the target date funds are using too, by the way, helps to kind of create better environments for employees to make decisions. And even some companies are dropping retirement income into plans. So where it's like it brings back that pension feel a little bit. So I'd say those are the handful of things that I've been seeing really kind of bubbling up to the surface in our space that we keep an eye on.
Fantastic. Well, Fred, this has been really interesting. I do a lot of work with you and I learned a bunch on this conversation. So I appreciate you coming on the show. If anybody is listening and they're like, man, we're not doing that, or, you know, we need more education for our employees or anything like that, this is what Fred does professionally. As many of our guests come on and talk about the things that they do professionally, reach out. You can reach out to me through the website or through LinkedIn, or you can reach out directly to Fred, but he would be happy to have these conversations. I know I'll put you out there, Fred, on that one, but I know you're good for it. If anybody needs help, definitely reach out. Want to get you the help, even if you're not looking for new advisors, just if you want to talk through any of these topics. I'm happy to do it. Happy to connect you with Fred. And I know he's happy to have a reach out too. So Fred, any closing comments?
It's always great to talk to you and nerd out a little bit. So thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, good luck everybody out there with your retirement programs and helping your people live healthy financial lives. Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.